there is the question of we have developing, and we had in one of our podcasts a guest who is an expert on rail freight between Asia and Europe, which is also growing a lot. It's the Eurasian rail freight system, which starts in some provinces in China and then through Western China to Kazakhstan, Russia, and then to the rest of Europe. And now we have even lines that go from Kazakhstan across the Caspian Sea to Turkey, and so on and so forth. So what is the difference, first of all, in the time of shipping by the sea and by land? And also, what is the difference in cost between the two systems?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the overland, the China-Europe Express, costs about $5,000 for a small container, the 20-foot container, or $8,000 for a shipping container to ship that from China to Europe. Journey time will be about 10 to 12 days. Now, the shipping cost used to be much less. To send a shipping container, that is the one that's measured up here at $8,000, to send that from China to Europe by sea would cost between $1,500 and $2,000, but it would take 3 weeks or more at sea. Now, this has been the typical picture that is presented. So you pay more by the overland traffic, but it goes faster. And this is very important, it goes on time. So you can plan it much more easily. And if you have the time to wait, doesn't matter because they're teddy bears or they are Christmas lights or whatever, then you can afford to send them by sea and it doesn't matter. It also matters a lot because if you send high value goods, the number of days it's traveling, you're still spending money. You have to borrow the money to have those goods. It's not earning you anything. And so the higher the value that's inside that container, the more it's costing you to hang around having it doing nothing, in other words. So this was the picture, but it's very interesting because the corona crisis and its effect have caused absolute chaos. So this month, these are the actual figures. If you want to send a container from Shanghai to Rotterdam, it's going to cost you almost $8,000 to send a shipping container, which is unheard of high. I mean, we're talking about a time when GDP has dropped, international trade has dropped, and yet we have record high freight rates.
That's by ships, you mean?
Yeah, by ships. And on the other direction, yeah, it's not much higher. It's 1,400 for a shipping container. So there is enormous pressure on capacity. And what's happened is COVID rules in managing the ports, large distribution bottlenecks, containers piled up in the wrong places, a complete disturbance of that maritime Silk Road logistics. So how long this situation will last? It's also because the shipping companies have combined to lower the number of ships that are shipping. I mean, the container shipping is almost cartelized. There's 3 big groups that dominate that Eurasian trade. And they, I think, have more or less combined in order to manage the market. But one of the results is, although the costs have gone up, the frequency has gone up as well, has gone down, and the delays have gone up. And this isn't just here. There was a mad situation last year when the price of oil tankers, hiring an oil tanker, went through the roof. And people were just buying and wanting any capacity to store oil because oil was so cheap. They couldn't offload it, but it'd be better just to hire a ship and use a ship as a sort of huge oil well until the price of oil went back up. So there are huge movements here.
Right.
But let's have a look at the longer term trend. The land bridge, I think, takes about 5% of the container traffic between Asia and Europe. Again, volume, price-wise, it could be higher if you take it in value terms, but that's about the thing. Last data we had, 2019, 8,200 trains went through. After that, this figure will be affected by the COVID pandemic. And that's in both directions. So they don't come back. The train won't make a return journey because they're separate trains anyway.
Yeah.
The maximum capacity of a train is 82 standard containers or 41 shipping containers. And that's because the length of a train traveling through Europe is fixed at 750 meters. That's what it can take. So let's have a look at how many containers might be carried. Let's assume that 2/3 of those trains are from China to Europe, 1/3 in the other direction, and they're fully loaded. Now, both of these are assumptions, and especially the fully loaded one, but that would mean 440,000 containers came by train from China to Europe last year. It sounds a lot until you look at what is happening with container trades. Rotterdam handles 14.5 million containers a year. All right, some of these will come from other European countries, some will come from America. Antwerp takes 11 million. Hamburg, 8.7 million. Bremen, 5.4 million. Just add those together, halve them or reduce them by a quarter. It doesn't matter. There is much more arriving by ship than is arriving by the land bridge. Piraeus, the new port, 4.9 million. Next Spanish port, and after that, 4.7 million. The world's 99th container port, which is Kingston, Jamaica, 1.6 million standard containers goes through that port alone. And this is the entire Europe-China trade going in one direction.
Yeah.
Now, you say, okay, what is the potential of it? Well, that's quite interesting. There's two issues. Firstly, those prices in China are held down by subsidies. There is enormous competition, especially between these three Central Asian hubs, Central Chinese hubs, Chengdu, Chongqing, and Xi'an, are fighting for this traffic, and they're paying subsidies. Now, the Chinese government wants these subsidies abolished. And it also has already said you can only subsidize a train if all of those containers are full and if the train is fully loaded. Now, we don't know how much that is actually being observed, but I think many of these routes will stay on paper with an occasional train with nothing like a regular traffic. Over half of the Europe-China Express come from those three cities. Now, the second problem is one of capacity. At the moment, those trains roll through Kazakhstan and Russia on the wider Russian gauge, so that the containers get transshipped on the border when it has to go onto a different gauge. This transshipment was seen as a terrible problem, but as long as the train is ready to take the new containers, it'll take you about an hour or more, hour and a half, to clear a complete train. To clear the documents for the shipping and everything else probably takes a couple of hours. So on a crossing, you should be able to deal with 12 trains a day. And if you have a crossing next door, there's 24 trains a day, but that's all. So there is an enormous capacity problem at the borders. And you see this last year, it was piling up on the border with Poland. Now, there are ways out. And one of the ways is, this is what the Latvians and Estonians say, yeah, we have Russian gauge, so we haven't got to transfer. So get the trains going through there and ship on through those ports. Ship them through to Russia and get them going to the Russian ports. Austria, I believe, has said, let's have a standard gauge, a Russian gauge railway into Austria and then dump them there. So that we don't have this two-phase of the bottleneck of transferring the containers. But at the moment, that remains a bottleneck on the borders of Europe. Now, Europeans, your EU, would love to solve it, and it can offer subsidies, but it cannot make a member state spend the subsidies to improve its border crossing. They are free to apply for an improvement. If they don't do that or do it slowly, there's not much Europe can do. So there are bottlenecks arriving at both ends of the corridor, and that, I think, limits a large expansion of that trade.
Right. So, so the land-based freight routes can never be a competitor to the shipping routes. and they will probably be reserved for lightweight, high-value commodities that need to reach the market quickly.
Yep, high-value commodities, just-in-time production, cooling and heating controls, because you can do that. You can't control the heating for 3 weeks at sea, but you can start having chilled vegetables and the like going across, or flowers or milk or meat products going on these routes. So there is an expansion there, but there is a quite clear capacity problem. So it's a niche market, an important niche market.
Right.
I don't think it'll ever become a mass market.
Right.
So the first thing to look at is the total amount of cargo that moves along this route between Asia and Europe. Now, some of it is Chinese, obviously. Some of it is Japanese, Korean, and of course European in the other direction. But the total cargo along that route grows from 9.6 billion tons to 11 billion tons in the last 6 years since the campaign was launched, the initiative. And then this includes container shipping in that tonnage, but we have separate data for container ships, and that's quite interesting because container shipping grows from 160 million. Now, TEUs is 20-foot equivalent units, so that's a 7-meter standard container, and a shipping container will be double that size, 40-foot equivalent unit. So this is how container capacity of a ship is measured. So basically, 160 million containers will go on that route, rising to 811 million containers. So that is 400% growth in 5 or 6 years. So that area has completely transformed. Now, containers are interesting. They account for probably about a quarter of the volume of traffic on the maritime Silk Road, but about 3/4 of the value, because they're mostly semi-manufactured goods, components, and finished goods. So the value added is very high. So I want to look a little bit more on containers because it shows what's happening in the maritime Silk Road. The average container ship, looking at the fleet of container ships 2013, was 3,000, 3,500 standard containers. And the largest ship at the time was 18,000, a single ship carrying 18,000 standard containers. If we move to the most recent numbers now, the largest ship now carries almost 24,000 containers in one ship. And the average size of container ship has risen accordingly. So the average size of container ships has risen by 25%, and the maximum size has risen even more. So there's been this large growth of shipping and size of ships, and that has huge implications for development. It means, for example, that at every time the ships are larger, which means the cranes to handle them have to be larger, which means that the docks have to be reinforced to take the leverage of the cranes. It means that there's more boxes being deposited on each visit. They have to be cleared from the dockside and have to be cleared from the port. And so the whole logistics of container shipping has changed. So only the very most modern ports can take these large ships, and they have to be able to handle them, because this isn't a lump of coal. Each of those containers is individual. It's ordered by one firm going to one destination. It's not like a ton of coal where the first ton is the same as the last ton. So you have to know exactly what you're doing. So the ports are becoming more mechanized, more automated, more computerized. But that's not all. Not only do you have to expand the port facilities and modernize them, but the ships that used to visit these larger ports now are passed downwards, down the scale, because once these large ships have arrived, then their produce is often redistributed also by sea, by ship. And so you get a cascade effect of these container ships going down until the small little ship that used to have its own crane attached has now more or less disappeared.
Yeah, so that's the concept of transshipment ports, like the Jebel Ali port in Dubai. It receives the large ships from Asia and Europe, and then it distributes it in smaller ships to the rest of the Gulf countries.
Yeah, like Singapore, which is a transit port par excellence, like Colombo, which is also a major transit port in the Indian Ocean, and like the ships in Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Piraeus, if you like, in Greece. They all have this same function.
Yeah. Okay, that's fascinating development there.